I knew the HOA president, Margaret, was bad news the day I moved in, but I had no idea just how far she would go. She had that signature HOA attitude, always complaining, always watching, and always convinced the world owed her something. The first time we met, she scowled at my outdoor decorations and reminded me that this isn't that kind of neighborhood. I should have seen it coming. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what she pulled last week. It all started when I came home late from work and found a sleek black Mercedes parked in my reserved spot. My spot. The one I paid extra for when I bought my unit. At first, I thought maybe it was some visitor who didn't know better. But then I saw the license plate. That smug little vanity plate that read MGR HOA. Margaret, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she was just parked there temporarily. So I knocked on her door. No answer. I called her number from the HOA directory, straight to voicemail. Fine. I figured I'd give her the benefit of the doubt and just park in the guest section for the night. But the next morning, her car was still there. I wasn't about to let this slide. I marched to her door and knocked until she finally answered. She barely cracked it open, peering at me like I was some kind of nuisance. "Margaret, your car is in my spot," I said, keeping my voice even. She crossed her arms. "Oh yes, I meant to talk to you about that. The HOA board has decided to reassign certain parking spaces for better community flow." I blinked. "What?" she sniffed. "Your spot is in a more convenient location, and as president I need access to—" "No," I cut her off. "I paid for that spot. It's in my deed. You don't just get to take it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, I already spoke with the board and they agreed." "I don't care what the board agreed to," I snapped. "Unless you have a legal document stating otherwise, that spot is mine," she huffed. "You're being difficult, Rebecca. It's just a parking spot." "Then why don't you park somewhere else?" I shot back. She rolled her eyes and shut the door in my face. That was it. I was done playing nice. I pulled up my HOA agreement, my deed, and every document proving that the spot legally belonged to me. Then I made a call, not to Margaret, not to the HOA, to a towing company. I explained the situation, provided all the necessary paperwork, and within the hour, a big, beefy tow truck rolled into the lot. I stood there, arms crossed, as they hooked up Margaret's precious Mercedes. "Where do you want it taken?" the driver asked. I grinned. "As far as you're legally allowed to take it." And just like that, they hauled her car out of the neighborhood, to another city entirely. The fallout from the tow was immediate. By the time I got home from work the next evening, Margaret was fuming. The second I stepped out of my car, now safely parked in my spot, she stormed across the lot, her face a shade of red that looked medically concerning. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. Instead, she jabbed a finger toward me, her voice shrill with rage. "You had my car towed." I didn't even pretend to be sorry. "No, I had a trespassing vehicle removed from private property." "Big difference?" She looked like she wanted to strangle me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I had important HOA business to attend to." I folded my arms. "Then maybe next time you should park in a legal spot instead of stealing someone else's." Her jaw clenched. "You're going to pay for this." I wasn't in the mood for her threats. Already did. "The tow company gave me a great deal." She let out a frustrated noise and stormed away toward her house. I watched her go, knowing this wasn't over. Margaret had been running the HOA like a personal fiefdom for years. She wasn't about to let someone challenge her authority without retaliation. Sure enough, the very next morning, a violation notice was taped to my front door. "Unauthorized towing of HOA member vehicle. Fine, $500. I laughed out loud. Margaret really thought she could fine me for enforcing my own property rights. Two could play that game. I went straight to my home office, pulled up the HOA bylaws, and started reading. It took me all of 10 minutes to find what I needed. Not only was there no rule against towing unauthorized vehicles, but there was a rule that explicitly stated HOA board members couldn't reassign private property without a community vote. Margaret had violated the bylaws. I grabbed my laptop and typed up a formal complaint, attaching scans of my deed, the HOA's rulebook, and a copy of the bogus fine. Then, for good measure, I CC'd every homeowner in the neighborhood. By that evening, my inbox was flooded with responses. Apparently, I wasn't the only one Margaret had been strong-arming. More than a dozen homeowners shared their own horror stories: random fines, sudden rule changes, and a complete lack of transparency with HOA funds. It was worse than I thought. That's when I got an email from Jeff, one of the homeowners on the board. Unlike Margaret's usual group of yes men, Jeff had always seemed reasonable. He wanted to meet in person. When we sat down at the local coffee shop, he wasted no time getting to the point. "Margaret's been running things unchecked for years," he said. "Most of the board is too scared to oppose her." "But after your email, people are finally starting to talk," I leaned forward. "So what do we do?" He glanced around, lowering his voice. "We vote her out." I raised an eyebrow. "Can we actually do that?" He nodded. "The bylaws allow homeowners to call for a special election if we collect enough signatures. We need a third of the community to sign a petition." I grinned. "Then let's start knocking on doors." For the next week, Jeff, a few other fed-up homeowners, and I went door to door gathering signatures. Some people were hesitant at first. Margaret had ruled with an iron fist for so long that many were afraid of retaliation. But once we explained the extent of what she'd been pulling, support grew fast. By the end of the week, we had more than enough signatures. Margaret tried to fight it, of course. She claimed the petition was invalid, that it was harassment, that we didn't understand how much work she did for the community. But the bylaws were clear. A vote was scheduled. On the night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. The tension was thick as Margaret sat at the front table, her expression icy. She must have thought she could intimidate her way out of this. She was wrong. When the votes were counted, the results were undeniable. Margaret was out. The second the final tally was announced, she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Without a word, she stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her. The room erupted in cheers. Just like that, the reign of Margaret was over. With Margaret ousted, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if a storm cloud had finally lifted. But there was still the matter of dealing with the mess she left behind. The HOA had been running unchecked for so long that half the homeowners didn't even know where their dues were going. There were rumors of missing funds, favoritism in rule enforcement, and even some shady contracts for maintenance work that never seemed to get done. Jeff, now the acting HOA president until we could hold an official election, called an emergency financial review. A few of us volunteered to go through the books, and what we found was worse than any of us expected. Margaret hadn't just been abusing her authority, she had been siphoning money. The ledger was a disaster. Payments to vague companies with no real contact information, checks written out to consultants who didn't seem to exist, and inflated invoices for basic repairs. But the worst part? A massive payment made just a few weeks earlier, $10,000, to a company called MGR Community Solutions. It didn't take a genius to figure out what the MGR stood for. With Jeff leading the charge, we dug deeper, tracking down the supposed repair companies Margaret had hired. 3 of them had never done any actual work in the neighborhood. One didn't even exist. The only contractor who picked up the phone told us he'd been paid to do minor landscaping, but had been instructed to overbill for HOA administrative fees. That was enough to take action. Jeff contacted a lawyer, and within days, we had a formal case against Margaret for financial mismanagement and potential fraud. But Margaret wasn't the type to go down quietly. The day after she got the official notice that she was being investigated, she showed up at the clubhouse, demanding to speak at an emergency HOA meeting. By then, word had spread about the missing funds, and the turnout was even bigger than the one for the vote. Margaret walked in like she still owned the place, her head held high, her eyes scanning the crowd with that same authoritative glare she had always used to keep people in line. But this time, no one looked intimidated. She launched into a defense, claiming the payments were legitimate, that she had been improving the community and that we were all ungrateful for the work she had done. She even tried to paint herself as the victim, saying she was being unfairly targeted by people who didn't understand how hard running an HOA was. But then Jeff pulled out a stack of printed invoices, highlighting the ones that led directly back to her personal bank account. The room went silent. Margaret's confidence faltered for the first time. She tried to argue to deflect, but the evidence was undeniable. She had been caught red-handed. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to press legal charges. Margaret, realizing she had no allies left, stormed out without another word. The next few weeks were a flurry of legal proceedings. The HOA's lawyer filed an official complaint, and a financial audit was launched. It didn't take long for authorities to get involved, and soon, Margaret found herself facing real consequences. The missing funds were traced back to her personal expenses, vacations, designer clothes, and even payments toward her Mercedes. Her car, the same one I had towed, was repossessed a month later. When it was discovered, she had been using HOA funds to cover part of the lease. In the end, Margaret was forced to pay restitution, and she was barred from holding any HOA position ever again. With her gone, the neighborhood finally had a chance to rebuild. Jeff was officially elected as the new president, and a new board was formed, one made up of homeowners who genuinely wanted to improve the community rather than control it. We rewrote outdated rules, made financial records fully transparent, and even lowered HOA fees after discovering how much of them had been wasted under Margaret's leadership. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was actually a nice place to live, and my parking spot, still mine with Margaret gone, things in the neighborhood finally started to settle. The HOA, now under Jeff's leadership, was focused on fixing the damage she had left behind. The financial audit revealed even more missing money than we initially thought, but with legal action underway, there was a real chance of recovering some of it. For the first time since I moved in, people actually felt comfortable stepping outside without worrying about an arbitrary fine or some nonsense rule being enforced. The tension that had ruled the neighborhood for years had started to ease, but Margaret wasn't done causing trouble. One evening, I was taking out the trash when I noticed a moving truck parked suspiciously close to the clubhouse. At first, I thought it was just someone relocating, but something felt off. There was no one supervising, no one directing the movers. Just a couple of guys hauling out boxes from the storage unit connected to the clubhouse. I walked closer, trying to get a better look at what they were taking. HOA records had been stored in that unit, along with old meeting notes, financial documents, and other paperwork. Jeff had mentioned wanting to go through them soon to make sure nothing important had been overlooked. Yet here these guys were, loading them into a truck in the dead of evening. I approached one of the movers, casually asking what they were doing. He barely looked at me, saying he was instructed to clear out old records for disposal. That set off every alarm in my head. I asked who had hired them, and after some hesitation, the guy admitted they had been paid in cash by a woman named Margaret. Of course. I immediately called Jeff, explaining what was happening. He told me to stall them while he got there. I turned back to the movers, putting on my best concerned homeowner act. I started asking questions, pretending to be a confused HOA member who was just looking out for the neighborhood. Where were they taking the boxes? Did they have an authorization form? Did they know that some of those documents might still be needed for legal reasons? The longer I talked, the more hesitant they became. They clearly hadn't expected to be questioned. Then Jeff arrived along with 2 other board members. He immediately took control of the situation, demanding to see any paperwork authorizing the removal. The movers had none. They tried to argue that they were just following orders, but Jeff wasn't having it. He told them to put everything back unless they wanted the police involved. That was enough to make them back off. As they started unloading the boxes, Jeff and I looked through them. Sure enough, these weren't just old records. They were financial documents, invoices, and even board meeting minutes, some of which had been mysteriously missing when we were investigating Margaret. She had been trying to cover her tracks. Jeff took pictures of everything, and we carefully locked the boxes back inside the clubhouse. Then he made another call to our lawyer. Margaret had already been facing legal trouble, but this was proof of intentional destruction of evidence. The next day, a formal complaint was filed against her. Things escalated quickly after that. The HOA's lawyer worked with authorities to subpoena Margaret for financial fraud. And now, with this latest stunt, obstruction of justice was added to the list. Margaret, of course, denied everything. She claimed she had simply been trying to clean up old records and that she had no idea she had hired movers to take important documents. But no one was buying it. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into her financial misconduct gained momentum. A forensic accountant was brought in to go through every transaction she had approved while in power. What they found was staggering. Margaret hadn't just been skimming money, she had been rerouting HOA funds into a personal account under the guise of consulting fees. She had paid herself tens of thousands of dollars using fake invoices and phony service agreements. The worst part? She had done all of this while raising HOA fees year after year, claiming it was necessary for community improvements that never happened. When the final report came out, the board held another emergency meeting. Homeowners packed the clubhouse, eager to hear just how deep the corruption had gone. Jeff laid everything out, detailing Margaret's financial manipulation, the fake contracts, and the missing money. The room was silent as he explained how she had funneled community funds into her own pocket while bullying homeowners into submission. Then came the final blow. The HOA's lawyer announced that Margaret would be facing formal charges, and a civil lawsuit was being filed to recover the stolen funds. That was the moment the neighborhood truly turned against her. Even the few people who had once supported her sat in stunned silence, realizing they had been defending a thief. Margaret, who had been avoiding any public appearances since her removal, was nowhere to be seen. Then, a few days later, she was gone. Her house, which had been a symbol of her control over the neighborhood, was suddenly empty. A for sale sign appeared overnight, and within a week, there were no signs that she had ever lived there. Rumors spread that she had left town, trying to escape the fallout. But running wouldn't save her from the legal consequences. With Margaret officially out of the picture, the neighborhood finally had a chance to move forward. The HOA underwent a complete overhaul. A new financial committee was formed to ensure transparency, and a set of checks and balances was put in place to prevent anything like this from happening again. The inflated fees Margaret had imposed were slashed, and several homeowners who had been unfairly fined were reimbursed. More importantly, the fear that had ruled the community for so long was gone. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up were now actively participating in meetings. People actually started looking out for one another instead of just trying to avoid HOA scrutiny. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live, it was a real community. And as for me, every time I parked in my rightful spot, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, All it took to bring down an HOA tyrant was standing up and refusing to back down. With Margaret gone, the neighborhood had a new energy, one that felt lighter and more cooperative. Without her constant meddling, people actually started talking to each other again, forming real connections instead of just exchanging forced pleasantries to avoid being reported for some minor infraction. It was the kind of place I had envisioned when I first moved in a community, not a dictatorship. But while Margaret had been removed, her damage lingered. Her fraudulent financial dealings had drained the HOA's reserves to dangerously low levels. The forensic accountant's report estimated that tens of thousands of dollars had been misappropriated under her leadership. And while legal proceedings were underway to recover those funds, it would take months, maybe longer, before the HOA saw any of it returned. In the meantime, the board had a real problem: how to keep the neighborhood running without resorting to the same shady tactics Margaret had used. Jeff called a meeting to discuss options. The clubhouse was packed, not with angry homeowners this time, but with people who genuinely wanted to help fix things. Ideas were tossed around: fundraisers, voluntary contributions, temporary cost cutting, but the reality was grim. Without immediate cash flow, services like landscaping, pool maintenance, and security patrols would have to be suspended. Then, an unexpected voice spoke up: Victor, a retired contractor who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. He had always kept to himself, mostly because he had been one of Margaret's many victims, receiving countless bogus fines for things like unauthorized tool storage, when all he had in his yard was a neatly covered workbench. Victor proposed something radical. Instead of outsourcing repairs and maintenance, why not rely on the community itself? He pointed out that many homeowners had skills that could be put to use: plumbers, electricians, landscapers, even accountants. If enough people volunteered, they could keep things running at a fraction of the cost until the stolen funds were recovered. There was some hesitation at first. After years of being dictated to, people weren't sure if they wanted to take on extra responsibility. But then Victor reminded everyone that they had already been paying for services that were never properly rendered. Margaret had funneled money into her own pockets while letting the neighborhood deteriorate. If they didn't step up now, they risked letting everything fall apart again. That argument struck a chord. One by one, people started offering their skills. A couple who owned a landscaping business offered to take care of the community green spaces. A retired accountant volunteered to go through the remaining financial records. Even Jeff, who worked in IT, promised to overhaul the HOA's outdated filing system to prevent future mismanagement. Seeing the community come together like that was something Margaret had never been able to accomplish. She had ruled through fear, but now people were working together willingly, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to take pride in their neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, the transformation was undeniable. Without Margaret's overpriced and questionably sourced contractors, the neighborhood actually started looking better. The landscaping was kept in pristine condition, the clubhouse got a fresh coat of paint, and even long-neglected repairs like the broken lights around the pool area were finally fixed. Even better, the HOA's finances, while still recovering, were no longer hemorrhaging money. The forensic accountant continued uncovering hidden expenditures, and with each discovery, the legal case against Margaret grew stronger. Then, just when we thought we had seen the last of her, she made one final desperate move. One evening, as I was walking my dog past the clubhouse, I noticed a car idling at the curb. It wasn't unusual for people to park there while waiting for someone, but something about the way the driver kept glancing around made me stop. The car was familiar, an older model sedan, nothing flashy, but I recognized the driver immediately. Margaret. She hadn't been seen in weeks, not since her house had gone up for sale. The last anyone had heard. She was staying with a relative in another city while she figured out her legal situation. Yet here she was, sitting in her car, watching the neighborhood like a ghost haunting the place she had once controlled. I kept walking, pretending not to notice her, but my mind was racing. What was she doing here? Checking on the damage she had caused, looking for some way to weasel back in. I wasn't the only one who had spotted her. By the time I looped back around, Jeff was outside, along with Victor and a few other homeowners who had been helping with the community projects. They weren't confronting her, just watching, waiting to see what she would do. Margaret must have realized she had been noticed because she quickly pulled away, disappearing down the street. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, an email went out to the HOA board. It was from Margaret's lawyer. She was threatening to sue the HOA, the claim that she had been unlawfully removed from her position, and that the financial accusations against her were unfounded character assassinations. She demanded reinstatement along with compensation for the mental and emotional distress she had suffered. I had to reread the email twice just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. Margaret, the same woman who had stolen from the community, who had tried to destroy evidence, who had lied and manipulated her way through years of corruption, was actually trying to force her way back in. It was almost funny. Almost. Jeff immediately forwarded the email to the HOA's lawyer, who wasted no time drafting a response. The short version: Margaret had no case. The removal had been done legally, the vote had been conducted properly, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. If she wanted to take it to court, she was free to try, but given the pending fraud investigation against her, it would only make things worse for her. That should have been enough to shut her down. But Margaret wasn't just desperate, she was delusional. Instead of backing off, she started reaching out to individual homeowners, trying to sway them to her side. She spun wild stories about how she had been framed, how Jeff and the new board were the real villains, and how if people didn't stand with her, they would regret it. It didn't work. Too much had changed. People had seen what a real, functional HOA looked like, and they weren't about to return to the nightmare Margaret had created. When she realized no one was listening, she finally gave up. The lawsuit was never filed. The emails stopped. The car lurking around the neighborhood never reappeared. Margaret was gone for good. With her final attempt at manipulation failing, the community only grew stronger. The projects continued, finances were stabilized, and more homeowners got involved in decisions that affected them. And for the first time in years, the HOA wasn't something people feared. It was something they were proud of. With Margaret gone and the HOA finally stabilizing, life in the neighborhood felt different. People who had once avoided each other out of fear of being reported were now chatting by their mailboxes, helping each other with small projects, and even organizing neighborhood events. The transformation was undeniable, but there was still one last mess to clean up. The financial audit had uncovered a tangled web of fraudulent expenses, kickbacks, and bogus service contracts. While the civil lawsuit against Margaret was still working its way through the courts, something else had come to light. Multiple vendors had been complicit in her schemes. Some of them had been funneling money back to her in exchange for inflated contracts, while others had simply been charging for services they never provided. Jeff and the new board weren't about to let that slide. After gathering enough evidence, they reached out to the district attorney's office. What had originally been a civil case was now turning into a criminal investigation. Prosecutors took an interest in the case, especially after uncovering just how much money had been funneled into personal accounts. What had started as an internal HOA issue was now something much bigger. One evening, I was walking past the clubhouse when I noticed a couple of unfamiliar cars parked outside. Inside, Jeff and a few board members were meeting with two men in suits. The atmosphere was tense, but not in the way it had been during Margaret's reign. It was the kind of tension that came with progress. Later, Jeff filled me in. The men had been investigators working with the district attorney's office. They were building a case, not just against Margaret, but against the contractors who had been involved in the fraudulent deals. The HOA had provided all the records they had uncovered, and it was now just a matter of time before formal charges were filed. But Margaret, despite disappearing from the neighborhood, still had one last surprise up her sleeve. A week later, a process server showed up at Jeff's door with a lawsuit not from Margaret this time, but from one of the shady contractors she had worked with. The claim: defamation. Apparently, one of the companies that had been exposed in the financial audit was trying to turn the tables, arguing that the HOA had damaged their reputation by reporting their fraudulent billing practices. It was a ridiculous claim, but it was enough to force the board to seek legal counsel again. Instead of backing down, Jeff and the board doubled down. They countered the lawsuit with a demand for full disclosure of the company's financial records, knowing full well that they wouldn't be able to provide legitimate documentation. Within days, the lawsuit was dropped. That was the final straw. With all the evidence stacked against her, Margaret was officially indicted on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. The neighborhood buzzed with the news. The woman who had once terrorized homeowners with arbitrary fines and threats of legal action was now facing real consequences. The day the news broke, a small group of residents gathered at the clubhouse, not to celebrate, but to reflect on how far things had come. The HOA had gone from a corrupt, oppressive entity to a community-driven organization that actually worked for the people living there. Even the financial situation was improving. After reviewing all the fraudulent expenses, the board was able to recover a portion of the stolen funds through legal action. Some of the vendors involved had opted to settle rather than face criminal charges, returning a significant chunk of the HOA's money in the process. With the financial pressure easing, the board voted to lower HOA fees, something that had once seemed impossible under Margaret's rule. A few weeks later, the neighborhood held its first real community event, a barbecue at the park. People who had never spoken before were sitting together, sharing food and laughing. Children were running around without parents nervously watching for rule violations. For the first time since I moved in, it felt like home. As I sat at one of the picnic tables, watching Jeff and Victor joke about who had done a better job fixing the clubhouse lights, I realized something. Margaret had spent years trying to control this neighborhood, bending rules and manipulating people to maintain her grip on power. But in the end, all it took to bring her down was a group of homeowners refusing to be intimidated. She had used fear to rule. We had used facts to win. And with that, the neighborhood had finally become what it was always meant to be, a place where people actually wanted to live.